"Get your trash out of my house," my stepdad shouted, and by trash he meant me. His voice cracked through the living room so loudly the guests at my mother's 60th birthday party stopped mid-sentence forks, frozen above half-eaten plates. I stood there holding the cake I had quietly paid for a double-layered lemon chiffon that Roy insisted someone from church had generously donated. He jabbed a finger so close to my face I could feel the heat from his breath. Look at her. No degree, no husband, no real future. Just some failed experiment playing on computers in Los Angeles. A dead weight, a parasite, trash. The room went silent except for the low murmur of neighbors and distant clinking from the backyard, where a few latecomers were still setting up card tables. My mother, Karen, pretended to adjust the ribbon on her dress, refusing to look at me. My younger brother, Tyler, stared at the ground, pretending to tie a shoe. Not one person said my name. Not one person said stop. Roy paced in front of me, performing for the crowd like he had rehearsed every insult. This girl's 29 years old, and what does she have? Nothing. No college, no real job, no stability. She floats around like some lost balloon while the rest of us carry responsibility. Even the church kids know how to build a respectable life. She can't even stick with community college. A pathetic internet hobby does not make her special. The whispers started. One woman said under her breath, "That's the one who lives in a tiny room in LA, right, poor thing." I swallowed hard, my phone buzzing repeatedly in my hand. I glanced down. New email. Subject line, Cloudwave acquisition final terms. A number I refused to read fully flashed across the preview. A number that could change any life. A number no one in this room could imagine belonged to me. They all thought I lived in a cramped apartment over a laundromat. They did not know about the views of Laguna Beach. They did not know about the deal waiting for my signature. They did not know anything because I had learned long ago that in a toxic family, the more you share, the more ammunition they get. Roy kept going, escalating each sentence like he wanted to snap something inside me. "You walk around here with that cheap dress and think you can talk about money. Trash doesn't get to talk about money. Trash doesn't get to act like family. You leech off everyone and give nothing back." I set the cake down. My hands shook, not from fear, but from a sudden stillness spreading through my chest like a quiet line of ice. I turned to my mother. "Are you really okay with this?" She finally looked up, but only for a second. "Not now, Ava. You are making a scene." She said it like I was the one who had flipped the table and screamed. She said it like I was the one who should be embarrassed. Tyler whispered. "Ava, maybe just go for a walk," but even he kept his eyes down. Roy saw their silence as permission, as he grabbed the old suitcase I had brought for my overnight stay and shoved it into me so hard it hit my ribs. "Get out. Trash doesn't live under my roof. You're not family." That word not cut sharper than all the others. Family. As if I had not sent money every month when I had almost nothing. As if I had not covered utilities, insurance, and groceries for years. As if I had not bailed them out quietly when debts piled up. I walked out the front door without crying, without begging, without giving them the performance they expected. Outside, the Honda they believed I drove sat under the streetlight, but I kept walking. 2 blocks down, my real car waited a midnight blue Tesla Model S, registered to a Shell LLC that owned exactly one other asset, the house. My house. The $5 million Laguna Beach estate no one in Riverside knew existed. I opened the door, slid inside, and let the silence swallow the last echo of Roy's voice. On the freeway, I switched to autopilot and opened the email fully. The acquisition figure blinked like a lighthouse beam in the dark. I typed 2 words, "Let's move forward. I will sign tomorrow." When I reached Laguna, the moon lit the ocean in long, silver strokes. I stepped out, still wearing the dress Roy called cheap, and walked toward the private gate. It recognized my key fob and opened slowly, revealing the glowing white lights of the Pacific Crest Estate. Marble path. Glass walls, the low hum of ocean wind wrapping around everything like a promise. I stood there barefoot on the stone walkway and breathed. Tonight I was thrown out as trash. Tomorrow they would learn exactly where trash goes when it walks away. I was 12 the summer my mother married Roy and moved us into his single-story house in Riverside, a place filled with the smell of motor oil and leftover paint from the garage where he kept all his tools, and at first everything felt harmless enough because he smiled wide and called me kiddo and patted my shoulder, like he was stepping into the role of a friendly neighbor rather than a stepfather. Yet even then, something in the back of my mind tightened every time he walked into a room, as if the air shifted a little colder around him. I remember the first week after the wedding when he brought home an old desktop tower. Someone from his plumbing crew was throwing out. The monitor flickered and hummed with a faint buzzing sound, but to me it was magic. I spent hours drawing simple shapes on paint and then slowly teaching myself HTML from a free tutorial I printed at the library, copying lines of code and testing them on the dusty browser, feeling a kind of excitement I could not explain to anyone except maybe my art teacher, who always said my hands worked ahead of my age. Roy would pass behind me and watch the screen for a few seconds, then shrug and say things like, "All that computer stuff is a phase, or kids need real skills, not doodles." And each time he said it, my stomach tightened even though I kept typing, because somewhere inside I believed that if I worked hard enough, someone in the house would finally see I was worth something. Karen tried to mediate during those early months, but she was newly married and trying to make the house feel peaceful. So she often smoothed things over by telling me Roy was old-fashioned, or that he just needed time, and I wanted to believe her, more than anything. Because she had been alone for so long after my father died that I felt guilty wanting anything for myself. One afternoon in late spring, I walked down the hallway toward the kitchen for a snack and stopped when I heard my name through the thin walls. Roy's voice was low but insistent, and he said something that made my blood freeze before I could even move my feet. He told my mother that the college fund my grandparents had left me was sitting there doing nothing while the kitchen cabinets were falling apart and his truck was on its last legs. He said any reasonable family would use that money for real needs, and that a kid who draws pictures on a computer was not exactly Harvard material anyway. Karen's voice wavered as she said, "We will put it back later, I promise." But even at 12, I knew adults only said that when they had no intention of doing it, and the realization hit me so hard that I pressed my back against the wall and stayed silent until they finished talking, feeling something crack quietly inside my chest, like a floorboard giving way. At dinner that night, I watched Roy pile food onto his plate and talk about the church kids who came over on weekends to help with yard work. He bragged about how they were responsible and respectful and how they earned straight A's because they knew how to listen to their fathers. Then he looked at me for a second too long and said, "Some kids waste time on computers because they do not understand the value of real work," and the whole table went quiet while Karen pretended not to hear the comparison. I learned in that moment that silence was safer than talking back, so I nodded and kept my eyes on my plate. But in my head, I wrote the moment, down not in a literal notebook, but in that mental ledger, where I stored every slight and every time someone tried to make me smaller than I was. By 13, I had built simple web pages, using nothing but trial and error, and I often stayed up past midnight experimenting with colors, changing margins, adjusting spacing, and imagining what a future in design could look like. Yet whenever Roy saw the glow from under my bedroom door, he knocked loudly and reminded me electricity was not free and that girls my age should focus on becoming responsible, not wasting hours on silly hobbies. Karen worked late shifts at the clinic and came home exhausted, so she said very little, offering a tired smile or a quick hug before disappearing into her room. And I loved her enough to never blame her for choosing the easier path, which was always silence, because silence kept Roy calm, and a calm Roy meant fewer long lectures and fewer moments where I felt like a guest in my own home. When I turned 14, my school offered a small elective program for basic coding and digital design. My teacher, Mrs. Daniels, pulled me aside after class and told me I had the kind of mind that could build anything she said college recruiters would love, a portfolio like mine someday. And for the first time, I let myself imagine getting out of Riverside and building something bigger than this house, with its peeling paint and its echoing hallways where my footsteps always felt too loud. At 15, I joined a school project that required designing a mock app for a local community event. I created the entire prototype by hand, sketching user flows, and then building a working interface in a simple program. The judges praised it during the showcase, and my teacher said she had never seen a student with such natural instinct for layout and function. I carried that praise home like it was made of glass, hoping to show it to my mother first, but she was out getting groceries, and Roy was watching television with a beer in his hand when I told him about the project. He looked at the mock-up and snorted, as if the entire thing were a joke, telling me no one makes real money drawing colorful screens, and that the world needs plumbers and electricians, not dreamers who sit in front of computers all day. His words landed with a heavier weight than usual, because I had walked through the door hoping he might say something neutral or even vaguely encouraging. But instead, he crushed the small flicker of pride I had carried home, and I felt the ledger inside me mark another line, another quiet betrayal. By 16, I understood that in this house I would never be enough, not smart enough, not obedient enough, not useful enough. Yet every insult and every moment of being dismissed became the seed of something sharp and determined that would one day grow into the fire I needed to walk away for good, although at that time I had no idea just how deeply his choices would shape the path I would take. By the time I turned 18, the quiet determination that had carried me through high school felt like a fragile rope pulled tight between hope and reality. And when the acceptance letter from California State University arrived in the mail one warm morning in early June, I held it gently, as if the paper itself were a living pulse. My name printed at the top and a line underneath, congratulating me on my conditional admission, the condition being that I would need to cover my own tuition and housing because the award package was minimal. But even that did not dim the flicker of pride that filled my chest as I imagined stepping onto a campus where no one knew me as the girl Roy dismissed every chance he got. Graduation weekend arrived quickly, Riverside baking under the early summer heat, and our backyard filled with the smell of grilled burgers as relatives drifted in, carrying potato salad and folding chairs, everyone talking loudly over country music from the radio, while Roy held court near the grill with a spatula in one hand and a beer in the other, bragging about his crew and how hard work built character. I remember feeling nervous, but excited, as I carried a stack of plates outside, because this gathering was supposed to be about celebrating the future, about acknowledging that I had made it through everything long enough to step into a new life, and part of me hoped, maybe just this once, Roy would let me have the spotlight without turning it into an excuse to belittle me. When my Aunt Linda asked with a big smile if I was ready for college and if my mother had the college fund paperwork sorted, I froze, the question hitting me so sharply that I glanced at Karen instinctively, waiting for her to explain something, anything, but she kept her eyes on the bowl she was carrying and said nothing, her silence ringing louder than any answer. Before I could open my mouth, Roy lifted his voice over the entire yard, laughing as if he had been waiting for this exact moment, saying there is no college fund. We used it for the house. If she wanted college, she should have gotten scholarships, like other kids, and the words fell like stones, one after another, while every person in the yard stopped talking and turned to look at me, their expressions shifting through surprise, awkwardness, and faint pity. I felt the ground tilt beneath me as everything I had suspected but refused to fully believe now unraveled right there in front of neighbors and relatives. The truth laid bare in the most humiliating way possible, while my mother stood 3 feet away, unable to meet my eyes, and something inside me tightened so sharply I had to hold my breath to keep from breaking. A woman from church leaned toward another and whispered, "Well, not everyone is meant for college. Some people just float around, and I wanted to disappear because that was exactly the kind of narrative Roy had always wanted to build about me. that I was the type of girl who drifted aimlessly without direction or ambition, even when I had spent years trying to prove otherwise. When the guests drifted back to their conversations pretending nothing uncomfortable had happened, I walked quietly to the side gate and stood there for a moment staring at the street beyond the fence, thinking about the letter sitting on my dresser and the future I had been so proud to imagine, and I realized that if I waited for anyone in this house to champion me, I would never leave Riverside at all. That night, I applied to the local community college instead, reasoning that if I worked part-time, I could at least save enough to keep moving forward. And when I told Roy my plan, he laughed, calling community college extended high school and insisting that I was wasting my time trying to chase something I would never achieve. But I kept my head down and enrolled anyway, because the alternative was giving up entirely. Over the next few months, I juggled classes with a part-time job at a small coffee shop near campus, spending early mornings making lattes and late nights finishing assignments while my classmates went to parties or joined clubs. And even though I felt exhausted, most days I also felt something no one in my family understood. I felt the beginnings of competence and independence, the sense that I could build something of my own, even if the world around me doubted it. In October, one of my design instructors encouraged me to create a small online portfolio, so I worked every spare minute building simple interface samples and posting them quietly on a site no one in my family even knew existed. And when a local shop owner emailed me offering $500 to design a clean and modern layout for their business, I thought I was dreaming. I remember finishing the project in 3 days, delivering it with shaky hands, and receiving the payment through a transfer that made my heart race, because it was the first time someone outside school validated the thing I loved, doing the first real evidence that my hours of learning and experimenting were not foolish or childish, but actually valuable. I came home glowing with pride, wanting so badly to tell my mother first, but she was working a late shift, so I shared the news with Roy, thinking maybe he would acknowledge how big that moment felt to me. But he barely looked up from the television and said, "500 is what a real man makes in a couple days with his hands. It is hobby money," and the words landed heavy enough to smother the excitement I had carried through the front door. I stood there silently absorbing the familiar ache of disappointment, because part of me already knew that no achievement of mine would ever matter to him unless it benefited him directly, and yet another part of me felt something different that night, not just hurt, but resolved the subtle recognition that his reaction no longer had the power to define the worth of what I was building. As I went to my room and opened my laptop, I stared at the interface I had designed and whispered quietly to myself that someday this hobby money would become something so significant that even Roy's voice could not diminish it. And although I did not know how or when, I sensed with absolute clarity that the betrayal at that barbecue, the public humiliation, the dismissal of my efforts were not endings but beginnings, seeds being planted in soil I did not choose, yet would one day shape the entire course of my life. Moving to Los Angeles at 19 felt like stepping into a world that finally breathed at the same pace I did, a place where no one knew my history or the humiliations that had shaped me. And when I found a tiny room in Koreatown barely big enough for a twin mattress and a folding desk, I felt strangely free, because even though the space smelled faintly of old carpet and the window rattled whenever a bus passed by, it was mine, and no one there could call me drifting or useless. I worked mornings at a cafe on Wilshire, wiping down counters while commuters rushed in for lattes, and I spent my afternoons hunched over my laptop, building early versions of a portfolio, teaching myself more complex UI concepts with every client request I accepted on Upwork and Dribbble, charging small amounts at first and increasing slowly as I gained confidence. And although I earned very little, I felt a thrill each time someone trusted me with their idea, because it reminded me that my work had value beyond the walls of the house I had left behind. Even in those early months when I was eating instant noodles and counting coins for laundry, I still sent my mother between $100 and $200 a month, telling myself it was the right thing to do because she deserved support even if Roy did not, and I wired the money quietly, hoping it helped with the bills, even though the sacrifice meant I sometimes skipped meals. One afternoon, while visiting Riverside for a quick errand, I overheard a neighbor tell someone that Karen was fortunate the church still offered assistance for households in need. And when she said it, she nodded toward my mother, who smiled awkwardly. And it hit me suddenly that the money I sent every month had been erased from the story entirely to avoid upsetting Roy, as if my contributions were too inconvenient to acknowledge. I stood behind the fence listening as Karen said thank you in a soft voice that hid exhaustion. And instead of mentioning me, she simply let them believe she was receiving some kind of community support. And though part of me wanted to be angry, the larger part understood she was still living inside the cage of his pride and could not risk provoking him by giving me credit. A few days later, Roy called me out of nowhere, his voice loud and irritated, demanding to know why I was wasting money paying rent in Los Angeles when I could move home, pay something real and be useful instead of chasing fantasy work. And the dismissiveness in his tone was so familiar that I felt my chest heat. But I kept my voice calm as I told him I was building my career and that living in LA gave me access to opportunities I could never find in Riverside. Yet he ignored everything and said if I had that kind of money to throw away, I should redirect it to the household instead of playing adult in a city that would spit me out. I hung up feeling shaken, but also strangely anchored because hearing him try to pull me back into that house reminded me why I had left and why I needed to keep pushing forward no matter how small my steps seemed. A month later, I received an email from a small tech company in Culver City asking if I would join them for a 3-month UI contract, and the offer paid more than anything I had ever earned, not a life-changing amount, but enough to make breathing easier enough to buy groceries without calculating every dollar enough to feel like I was finally doing something that mattered. I accepted immediately, and the first day I stepped into their office with its whiteboards full of ideas and tables covered with laptops, I felt like I had crossed an invisible threshold, one where my brain, rather than my obedience, held value. And when I told my mother about the opportunity, she sounded genuinely proud for the first time in years, though her voice still held that apologetic softness, as if pride were something she had to hide. When Roy found out, he barely reacted except to say, "Temp work is not a career, you are drifting." And he said drifting in that way that made it sound like a moral failing rather than a transitional phase. But instead of shrinking like I used to, I simply said I was doing fine and ended the call before he could continue his lecture. Working at the small company taught me more in weeks than I had learned in months on my own, and little by little, I saw my savings grow, even if only by a small amount at a time. And each night I came home to my tiny room, I stared at the balance on my banking app, imagining what it might feel like one day when the number started with something other than a few $100s. On days when Roy called drunk or irritated, I began blocking his number for a few hours to protect my peace, because I realized I could not build a future while letting his voice tear at me every time he felt entitled to anger. And though I never blocked my mother because she still needed me, I created a quiet boundary he would never fully see. Tyler called occasionally asking about life in LA, and I could hear in his voice the conflict he felt wanting to stay in touch with me while living under Roy's rules, and I never pressured him because I knew what that house did to people. There was a quiet evening near the end of the year when I opened my banking app and saw the very small but undeniable total I had earned through my work, and I whispered to myself, someday, this account will not be empty, and when that day comes, they will have no idea where the money came from. And speaking it aloud filled me with a calm resolve that made every late night and every bowl of noodles feel like stepping stones rather than setbacks. What hurt the most during that time was knowing that the small support I gave my mother each month had been rewritten into someone else's narrative turned into charity from the church, rather than the sacrifice of a daughter carving her own path. And even though that betrayal was quieter than the ones before, it carried a sting that settled deep into me, the kind of sting that later fueled every step of my rise, because it reminded me that the people who claimed to know me best had never truly seen me at all. By the time my contract in Culver City ended, I had begun to understand something I had never allowed myself to believe before, that my work had the potential to be more than small freelance gigs and temporary employment. And that realization made the city feel different, as if every street carried a possibility I had not noticed during those first hungry months in Koreatown. I started spending my free hours in a co-working space in Santa Monica, a bright, airy place filled with people who were chasing their own ideas. And it was there that I met James Patel, who had left his agency job the same week I did, after deciding he could no longer endure the endless cycles of revisions for clients who treated creativity like a disposable commodity. We bonded quickly over our frustration with traditional design workflows, and one afternoon, while staring at a sketch on a whiteboard, we wondered aloud what it would look like to automate the earliest stage of UI creation, not to replace designers, but to speed up the tedious parts that drained energy from the real creative decisions. And within weeks, we had turned that question into a scrappy prototype that generated layout suggestions using machine learning models we trained through nights of trial and error. We named the tool Read Vision partly for me, and partly because it felt like reclaiming a piece of my own future, and we offered early access to a handful of small businesses that needed simple mobile app layouts, the kind of businesses that could not afford agencies but desperately needed something clean and functional. And while the revenue at first was small, the monthly recurring income grew slowly and steadily in a way that felt like the quiet beginning of something bigger. I still had not told my family that I was a founder, because even the thought of describing this early, fragile success to Roy made my stomach tighten. So, whenever my mother asked how work was going, I simply said I was doing design for a tech company and left it at that, preferring to protect the small flame of my achievement from being smothered by his skepticism. It was around this time that Roy called, asking for a favor in that tone he used whenever he wanted something for free, while pretending it was an opportunity for me. And he said a buddy of his who worked construction needed a website to promote his services, because business had been slow. He claimed it would be simple and quick, and that I was the only one who could help without charging a ridiculous amount of money. I hesitated because I knew what free work had cost me in the past, but my mother gently asked if I could at least take a look, and because I still clung to the hope that doing something kind might ease the tension between us, I agreed, spending several late nights creating a clean, modern layout with a logo that matched the brand aesthetic he wanted, yet could not articulate. When I finished the website, it looked professional and polished, in a way that made even me proud, and I sent the files to Roy, who responded with a brief thanks that felt more like acknowledgement of a transaction than appreciation of the hours I had poured into it. A week later, I drove to Riverside for a small family gathering, and as soon as I walked into the backyard, I heard Roy's voice booming proudly as he told his friends that Tyler had helped his buddy with an amazing website because that boy had real skills, and he said it with such confidence that it took me a full moment to realize he was taking my work, handing it to someone else, and rewriting the story entirely. I stood there holding a plate of food I could no longer taste as the humiliation settled over me. Because no matter how far I moved or how much I grew, he still found ways to chip away at my accomplishments, and the sting of having my work handed to Tyler as if my contribution did not exist hit deeper than I expected, because it reminded me of every time in my life when recognition was pulled away the second it might have meant something. I did not argue, not because I agreed, but because I knew arguing would only fuel his narrative that I was emotional, selfish, ungrateful. So I smiled tightly and walked inside, letting the conversation fade behind me, while something inside me hardened further into resolve. That night, when I returned to my small room in Los Angeles, I opened the back end of the website and placed a microscopic watermark in the lower corner, a tiny Read Vision signature that no one would notice unless they looked very closely, and I did it not for recognition, but as a quiet reminder to myself that my work had value even when others tried to steal it for themselves, a small, silent act of rebellion that made me feel more in control than I had in years. The next time Roy called asking for another favor, I told him calmly that I was too busy with my projects and could not take on additional work, and he snapped, accusing me of being selfish and of not understanding how family worked, which only confirmed that he had never seen me as family at all unless I was serving his needs. I hung up feeling strangely light because setting that boundary made me realize that his approval no longer had any bearing on my future, and for the first time it felt possible to separate who I was becoming from the limitations he tried to impose on me. As Read Vision continued to grow with more users trickling in and small clients renewing their subscriptions, I found myself thinking often about how many years I had spent internalizing the idea that I was not enough, and how each small success now felt like unlocking a door that had been bolted shut by his words, and I knew that the pain of being erased in front of his friends would eventually become part of the larger story I was building. I learned during this time that betrayal did not always explode dramatically. Sometimes it unfolded quietly in backyards and family gatherings where your achievements were rewritten or handed to someone else. And that realization shaped the edge of my determination, because I understood that one day when my work stood undeniable, I would not need to raise my voice to prove anything. The truth would reveal itself without my help. Read Vision was still small but steady when I decided to apply for a modest business loan, something just large enough to cover a second server cluster and a part-time developer, so James and I could stop patching code at 2 a.m. and finally build the features our early clients kept asking for. And I remember feeling hopeful as I filled out the application because for the first time, growth felt possible and within reach. Yet that hope cracked almost instantly when the rejection email arrived, not with suggestions for improvement, but with a blunt notice that my credit score was far too low to qualify. I stared at the screen for several minutes, rereading the line about multiple delinquent accounts, because I had never in my life opened more than a single starter credit card, the kind with a tiny spending limit and a higher interest rate, and I always paid the balance before it accrued a fee. So the idea that I suddenly had missed payments felt impossible until something cold and familiar curled up in my chest, the same cold that had appeared years earlier when Roy admitted in front of an entire party that my college fund was gone. I logged into a credit checking service and my stomach dropped as I scrolled through the report, finding not one, but several accounts. I never opened 2 credit cards tied to the Riverside address, one store card from a home improvement chain, with a balance almost maxed out, and all of them opened during years when I'd been living in Los Angeles, trying to survive on cup noodles and cheap rent. For a moment, I could not breathe because the betrayal was so quiet, so calculated, and so familiar that it felt like the floor beneath me shifted, and I realized with a clarity that made my hands shake that someone had been using my identity to fund things I would never have agreed to, things connected to a house I no longer lived in. I called my mother first, hoping for some kind of explanation, even if it hurt, and when she answered, her voice was soft, distracted, almost hesitant, as if she already knew what I was about to ask, and when I said, "Mom, there are accounts in my name tied to your address, and I need to know what happened," she paused long enough for me to hear her swallow before saying, "I thought Roy told you." The sentence hit me harder than I expected because it confirmed everything I feared, that she knew something was wrong, yet chose silence again, and the ache of that familiar abandonment made my throat tighten as I asked to speak with Roy. When he picked up, he sounded irritated from the first word, as if the inconvenience of being questioned outweighed the seriousness of what he had done. And when I confronted him, he denied it with confusion, too quick to be believable, before shifting to defensiveness, saying your credit was sitting there unused, and we kept a roof over your head for years. Using your credit was just balancing things, and the righteousness in his tone made my stomach twist, because he truly believed he was entitled to my identity as if it were a family resource he could claim whenever he felt like it. I asked why he had not told me about the accounts, and he scoffed, saying if you had any sense of duty to this family, we would not have had to do it in the first place. And hearing him reduce years of my efforts to some distorted notion of debt made me realize that, to him, I had never been a daughter or even a person, just a repository he could draw from when convenient. After I hung up, I sat in the quiet of my tiny apartment, staring at the list of transactions, and it was then I noticed several charges connected to a building supply store, items like tiling equipment and lumber and electrical components, and the pattern was unmistakable. They were buying materials for home repairs under my name while reporting other projects to qualify for assistance. A small-scale fraud that would fall on me if anyone ever investigated. I felt panic rise in my chest because this was no longer just a mistake or a misunderstanding. It was a deliberate act that could destroy my financial future before it even began, and the weight of it settled over me like a heavy fog as I realized that my own family had turned me into a shield so they could cut corners without consequence. I booked a consultation with a lawyer recommended by a coworker, a woman with a sharp voice and sharper eyes, who reviewed the reports and told me plainly that I had enough evidence to file charges for identity theft and fraud charges that could lead to fines or worse, depending on how the investigation played out. And for one brief moment, I imagined myself following through, letting the system force accountability onto a man who had never once taken responsibility for the damage he caused. But when the lawyer explained that shared household accounts and overlapping addresses could complicate things and possibly implicate both my mother and Tyler, I felt my anger drain into something quieter and more painful. Because even though they had allowed this to happen, I could not stomach the thought of dragging them into a legal battle they were too fragile to survive. I walked out of the office that day with a folder full of paperwork and a decision forming inside me, a decision to pay off the debts myself, piece by agonizing piece, not because they deserved saving, but because I needed to free myself from the weight of their choices before I could build anything meaningful. And that realization marked the moment I understood what silent revenge truly meant. Instead of filing charges, I spent the next few weeks closing every unauthorized account, disputing what could be disputed, and paying off what could not. Each repayment a reminder that I would never again allow them access to any part of my life they could use as leverage. And when the balances finally dropped to zero, I felt a kind of freedom I had not known since childhood. My first act of quiet retribution was simple, yet deeply satisfying. I called every utility company still billing my name at the Riverside address and transferred or canceled each account so that Roy would have to stand on his own for the first time in years. No more discounted rates tied to my credit. No more easy excuses, and when the internet service representative told me she had completed the disconnection, I felt an unexpected rush of relief. I also canceled the phone line I had unknowingly been paying for the one they used freely while telling everyone they barely scraped by, and the irony of stripping away what they had taken for granted made something inside me settle with a calm finality. When everything was done, I stared at my cleared accounts and whispered to myself that this was the last time my name would ever be used without my consent, and the last time I would allow their version of family to control any part of my future, because this betrayal had not just cost me financially, it had sharpened the edges of my resolve and planted the seeds of a justice I was no longer afraid to claim. Success did not arrive with fireworks or applause. It grew quietly in the background, the same way a tide rises unnoticed until you look up and realize the shoreline has changed forever. And that was exactly how the next 2 years unfolded as Reed Vision moved from a small side project built in a co-working space to a fully funded tech company, catching the attention of investors who usually ignored founders without Ivy League pedigrees. When James and I secured our seed round, the amount felt unreal, a validation that someone outside our little bubble believed in what we were building, and we hired our first engineer who worked out of a spare bedroom in Echo Park, coding late into the night, while I redesigned our onboarding flow to reduce friction for new clients. The tool improved each month, our user base doubled, then tripled. And by the time we arrived in San Francisco for a small product design conference, we had enough traction to attract interest from Cloudwave, a larger tech company known for acquiring tools that solved real problems for small businesses. Standing on the conference stage delivering a talk about automated layout generation, I felt something shift inside me, not because of the applause afterward, but because the people who came up to me afterward spoke to me with respect, asking questions about roadmap and potential integrations, treating me as a peer in the industry rather than a child playing with screens. Yet that same night, when I called my mother to check in and let her know the event had gone well, Roy shouted something in the background about how I needed to stop bragging and remember that building apps was not real work. And when he grabbed the phone for a moment, he called me kid and told me not to get big-headed over little things, as if any milestone I achieved must be shrunk until it felt too small to matter. I hung up with a calm. I had learned to cultivate a calm that came from knowing my worth, no longer lived in his house or in his approval. And as the months passed, Cloudwave expressed genuine interest in partnering with us, which made me think more seriously about my long-term stability. I found myself looking at real estate listings in quieter coastal neighborhoods south of Los Angeles places, where the air felt cleaner and the ocean muted everything sharp inside me. And one evening, while scrolling, I saw a listing for a modern estate in Laguna Beach with a view that made my breath catch. $5 million, and out of reach for most people, yet not out of reach for someone who believed enough in their future. I contacted a lawyer and created an LLC because part of me still wanted the protection of anonymity, especially from a family that saw any sign of success as an invitation to take rather than celebrate. And after weeks of paperwork, I signed the closing documents in a quiet office overlooking the water, while the attorney slid the keys across the table and congratulated me. At that exact moment, while I was stepping into a home I had earned with years of silent work, Roy was apparently at the local church potluck, bragging loudly that his stepdaughter was crashing on couches in Los Angeles, telling anyone who would listen that this was what happened when kids did not finish school and chose irresponsibility over family duty. And though part of me winced when I heard about it later, the larger part of me felt an unexpected amusement at how wide the gap had grown between his narrative and my reality. Moving into the estate felt surreal because it was bigger than anything I had ever imagined for myself. Wide windows overlooking the Pacific, clean, minimalist lines that reminded me of all the design blogs I used to read for inspiration, and a quiet that made me feel like I could finally exhale after years of holding my breath. I spent months redecorating one room at a time, choosing sustainable furniture from small coastal vendors, meeting local artists who created handmade ceramic pieces that warmed the space. And because I supported so many independent businesses, they began referring to me as one of their best clients, a woman who appreciated craftsmanship more than status, which I found strangely grounding. As Reed Vision grew, Cloudwave invited me to advisory dinners where founders discussed market gaps and design ethics, and after a few conversations, I was asked if I wanted to advise smaller startups in exchange for small equity stakes, an opportunity that diversified my income in ways I never expected, because each stake represented a seed that might one day grow into something substantial. Despite all this growth, I still kept my family at a distance, maintaining the same narrative whenever my mother asked about my living situation, telling her I rented a small place near the beach because it was closer to work and more convenient for meetings. A half-truth that protected my peace and prevented Roy from imagining ways to benefit from what he believed he was owed. I still cared for Tyler in my own way, even if he had not yet learned to stand up to his father. and when I heard he was struggling to find a steady job, I quietly reached out to a contact in a manufacturing shop near Riverside, asking them to consider him for an entry-level role because I knew he needed a chance unrelated to Roy's influence. And when he got the job, he called me sounding relieved, believing it was pure coincidence. And I let him believe that because I wanted him to build confidence without feeling indebted. Late at night, I often stood on the deck of the estate watching the waves roll in under the moonlight, feeling the strange blend of pride and sadness that comes with success born out of necessity rather than encouragement. And I realized that this chapter of my life was no longer about proving Roy wrong, because he had never been a worthy opponent. It was about reclaiming everything he tried to define for me and rewriting my future with my own hands. The night of my mother's birthday felt strangely heavy from the moment I stepped through the front door, as if every memory of every slight I had endured within those walls stirred the air and waited for its cue. Yet I still told myself this might be the last chance for the family to meet me halfway, the last fragile hope that maybe they would see me without the filter of Roy's constant belittling. The living room was full of voices and the smell of overcooked brisket relatives, balancing paper plates while trying to avoid knocking over the folding tables. And when I walked in with a bouquet of flowers, Karen's face softened for a second before she glanced nervously toward Roy, as if checking whether my presence was permissible. The conversation drifted quickly toward money because it always did. Someone mentioned how expensive catering had become, and another asked who covered what, and Roy sighed loudly, saying, "We are tight this month." While Karen forced a smile that did not reach her eyes, the kind of smile she wore whenever survival required pretending everything was fine. I offered calmly to take care of the bill because it was her 60th birthday, and I wanted her to enjoy it without worrying. But Roy waved his hand dismissively in front of the whole room, saying, "We do not need charity from someone who cannot even hold a real job." And a few people laughed nervously, while my mother looked down at the tablecloth as if hoping the pattern would swallow her. A cousin I barely knew asked how life in Los Angeles was, and whether I liked my apartment. And before I could answer, Roy cut in, saying she lives in some shoebox with God knows who, because that is what happens when you live like trash. And the words landed with a sting so sharp it felt physical, especially because he said them so casually as if they were facts everyone already agreed on. I steadied my breath and chose not to react, because I had learned long ago that reacting only fed him. Instead, I changed the subject slightly and asked if they were having trouble with the mortgage, because I could help if things were difficult, saying it gently, not as pity, but as an extension of care to my mother, who deserved more stability than he ever gave her. But before I could finish the offer, he slammed his palm onto the table so loudly forks rattled against plates, shouting, "See, she wants to wave her little app money in our faces. This is what I mean. Trash with an ego." And the room went silent, except for the sound of someone clearing their throat in discomfort, while Karen's shoulders curled inward as if bracing for impact. Tyler whispered, "Dad, maybe do not." But Roy snapped that he was the only real father figure in this house, and that I should be grateful for the roof they gave me a twisted version of reality. He repeated so often he believed it belonged in every conversation about me. I scanned the room slowly, seeing a mixture of pity and judgment on faces that once smiled at me when I was younger, and something inside my chest tightened in a way that felt like finality, because I realized they would always believe the version of me that Roy painted, rather than the woman I had fought to become. When he stood up fully and pointed at me with a finger trembling with self-righteous anger, I felt the entire world narrow into that moment. His voice booming, "You are trash. You never finished school. You never started a family. Your so-called job is a joke. Get out of my house," each accusation rising like a wave, meant to drown me in front of everyone I once called family. I looked at my mother, hoping for even a flicker of defense, a single word to break the pattern of silence she had always chosen when conflict rose, but she turned her head away with a trembling breath and whispered, "Not now, Ava." You are making a scene." And in that instant, the last hope I had been carrying shattered like thin glass underfoot. My heartbeat steadied in a way that surprised me, and I heard my own voice rise smooth and controlled as I said, "You want me gone? Fine. You are on your own now." Words spoken not from anger, but from a clarity so sharp it cut through the noise of the room. Roy sneered as if he thought he had won something, but I knew better. I knew this sentence would mark the beginning of a shift he could not anticipate, because everything he believed about my life was built on assumptions that would soon collapse. I walked toward the door while whispers spread behind me, some asking if I was overreacting, others claiming Roy had finally said what needed to be said, and as I stepped into the night air, I realized the ache in my chest was not pain, but release, the release that comes when you finally stop begging someone to see your worth. I did not slam the door or look back, because I wanted them to sit with the silence I left behind to feel the absence of the person they had taken for granted, and as I reached my car, I whispered quietly to myself that this was the moment everything would change, not because I wanted revenge, but because truth had a way of resurfacing no matter how deeply someone tried to bury it. That night seeded something irreversible, something that would return to them, not in fury but in consequence, because when Roy called me trash in front of everyone, he unknowingly set the stage for the truth that would rise later, like a tidal wave. And those who watched it happen would remember this night not as a family argument, but as the beginning of the reckoning they never saw coming. The morning after the birthday disaster unfolded in a way that felt almost unreal, as if the universe had decided to place two versions of my life side by side and ask me which one I intended to step into permanently. And when I woke to the sound of waves crashing against the rocks below my Laguna Beach deck, I lay still for a long moment, letting the salt air fill my lungs, feeling a kind of lightness I had not felt in years, as if something heavy had finally slid off my shoulders during the night. The sun was rising in slow ribbons of gold across the water, and as I stepped onto the balcony with a cup of coffee, the memory of Roy shouting trash felt distant, not erased, but stripped of its power, and I realized that no one in that living room knew the truth about my life. The view I woke up to, the company I had built, the future I was finalizing that very morning. At 9, I sat at my dining table with my laptop open, waiting for the Zoom call with Cloudwave, and when their acquisition lead joined the screen with her usual warm confidence, I felt a wave of calm, because this was the world I had created for myself, a world built without their approval, a world that existed because I refused to let their words shape my limits. The deal we had been negotiating for months finally reached the finish line, and when she said we are ready to finalize at $40 million, with you retaining 25% equity, if that works for you, I felt the breath leave my body not from shock, but from the quiet, profound recognition that everything I had endured had led me to this precise moment, a moment where I became the kind of women in tech success story I once only admired from a distance. I agreed to the terms, and when the documents arrived seconds later, I signed them with steady hands, feeling something inside me unlock, and after the call ended, I rested my forehead against my palms and allowed myself to feel the victory in silence, not the loud, triumphant kind, but the kind that fills the chest slowly like warm light. The contrast between my morning and theirs was stark, because while I was signing a multi-million-dollar deal, Roy was apparently on the phone, arguing with a bank representative about overdue mortgage payments and tax notices. His voice loud enough that neighbors later said they heard him through the open window. And I received this information not because I looked for it, but because the bank sent me a text confirming that an old automatic payment tied to my name had been fully cleared and removed as part of the final disputes I had settled weeks earlier, a reminder that the safety net I once provided their household was gone for good. That message was the spark that pushed me into a series of quiet, precise actions, small but deeply satisfying ways of detaching myself fully from everything they had taken from me. And the first thing I did was call every utility company still associated with my old address to ensure each account was fully transferred out of my name, meaning Roy would finally have to stand behind the true cost of the life he insisted he provided alone. The customer service agent on the electric line confirmed the transfer cheerfully, and for the first time in a long time, I felt something like justice settle in my spine. Not revenge in the dramatic sense, but a reclaiming of what had been mine all along. After that, I logged into the insurance portal where I had for years quietly kept an auto-pay policy, covering both my mother's car and Roy's truck, because my mother once confided they could not afford a repair or an accident, and I wanted her to be safe, and I canceled his coverage immediately while maintaining a new separate policy, just for my mother under an LLC to keep it protected from him. And the symbolic weight of cutting off that financial umbilical cord made me exhale with relief. I poured myself another cup of coffee and opened my contact list, scrolling until I found the number of a lawyer I knew through the tech circuit, a woman who specialized in harassment and liability cases. And though I was not ready to take action, I asked if she could be on standby in case Roy tried to retaliate or claim something he believed he deserved. And she agreed without hesitation, saying people like him always circle back when they realize the well has dried. That afternoon, I appeared on a podcast hosted by a female founder in San Diego, a conversation we had scheduled weeks earlier about the intersection of tech innovation and personal boundaries. And as we talked about toxic family patterns, family betrayal, and the emotional cost of financial success, I chose my words carefully, never naming specifics, but speaking with such raw clarity that listeners sent messages afterward saying they felt seen. And for the first time, I felt the power of telling the truth without giving anyone the ammunition to use it against me. By evening, the light had shifted to a soft orange glow, and as I checked my email, I saw 2 subject lines that made me sit up straighter. Forbes requesting commentary on the Cloudwave acquisition and Business Insider, reaching out for a feature on female founders redefining the industry. And I read both messages slowly with a calm, steady thrill, because it was the first time major publications wanted my voice, not because of luck, but because of the empire I had quietly built. I leaned back in my chair, watching the sky darken over the ocean, thinking about how different this day had turned out compared to the previous night when Roy screamed at me in front of everyone, calling me trash, while I stood there holding the secret of a life he could not imagine. And I realized the greatest revenge I possessed was the life he had no power to touch. That night, as I locked the balcony doors and prepared for bed, I whispered to myself that these small acts of reclaiming were only the beginning, because I had finally taken back everything he once believed he could control. And the truth would eventually lead him to confront a reality he spent years trying to bury under insults and lies. The morning heat was already rising when the motion alert chimed on my phone, a soft vibration I barely noticed at first because I was finishing an email draft for the Forbes editor. But when I glanced at the screen and saw the camera feed from my front gate, I froze, staring at the image of my mother, Tyler, and Roy, standing outside under the harsh Laguna Beach sun, looking nothing like the confident people who had mocked me only days earlier. Karen's shoulders were slumped and her eyes were red as if she had been crying for hours. Tyler kept shifting his weight anxiously and glancing toward the street, and Roy stood with his hands on his hips, trying to look authoritative, despite the exhaustion etched across his face. And for a long moment, I simply watched them without moving, because part of me needed to understand that this was real, that they had returned not out of love, but out of need. Karen looked up toward the camera as if she knew I was watching, and her voice cracked as she said, "Ava, honey, we need a place to stay just for a little while. Everything is falling apart," but before I could process her words, Roy stepped forward, glaring directly into the lens, and barked open the gate. We are family, you owe us the command, hitting me with the force of every entitlement he had ever thrown at me. I inhaled slowly, letting the ocean breeze steady my thoughts, then pressed the button to open the gate because I needed them to see the truth with their own eyes, not through my explanations, but through the world I had built without them. As they walked up the stone path, their footsteps echoing faintly, I opened the massive glass door and stepped aside, gesturing for them to enter. Watching their eyes widen as they took in the high ceilings, the bright natural light, the panoramic view of the Pacific crashing against the cliffs below, and for the first time I saw the shift in their faces, the moment when they realized the narrative they had clung to about my life no longer made sense. I led them through the living room to the wide window facing the water, and Roy tried to mask his shock by puffing out his chest and saying, "So, your little app job pays for this," as if he could still shrink my accomplishments with a single sarcastic remark. But I met his gaze calmly and replied, "This is one of my places letting the words settle, like a quiet ripple across the room, because I wanted him to feel the weight of how wrong he had been." Karen murmured an apology that wavered between guilt and denial, saying he did not mean. What he said that night, he was upset, he was drinking. Yet even as she defended him, her hands trembled and she would not meet my eyes, and I saw the conflict in her, the realization that the story Roy had built around me was collapsing right in front of her. I gestured for them to sit and opened my laptop, placing it gently on the coffee table before pulling up the article that had gone live that morning, titled "From Trash to Tech Titan, Ava Reed's $40 million Exit." The headline glowing brightly on the screen as if mocking every insult Roy had hurled at me. And when I turned the laptop toward them, the silence grew so thick it felt like the air itself held its breath. Karen covered her mouth as she scrolled. Tyler blinked rapidly as if trying to confirm what he was seeing, and Roy's face darkened as he muttered something about media lies. But I simply waited because there was more he needed to see. I opened a folder containing years of bank statements showing the money I had quietly sent home. The bills I had paid, the insurance policies I had covered, the little acts of support they had erased from the story. And when Karen saw the total, her knees buckled slightly, as if the years of denial finally crashed into her all at once. Next, I opened the property file showing the LLC ownership of the house they were standing in, and the transaction record from when I purchased it, something undeniable and legally binding. And Karen whispered, "Ava, you bought this," as if saying the words made them real. The front door chimed then, and Mrs. Johnson, the elderly neighbor, appeared holding a plate of lemon bars because she had heard voices and thought it polite to bring something by. And when she stepped into the room, she greeted me warmly before noticing the tension, asking gently if everything was all right. But before I could answer, Roy snapped. "This is all lies. She is making herself look good." And his voice echoed through the space in a way that made him sound small rather than powerful. I turned the laptop toward Mrs. Johnson and showed her the documents one by one, explaining calmly what each represented, and she nodded solemnly because she had known for years that something was wrong in the way my family spoke about me, and her presence became a quiet, neutral witness, someone Roy could not shout down or manipulate. Tyler's eyes widened as he read an invoice showing that his trade school tuition had been paid by me through a third-party account, and he whispered, "I thought Mom paid for that," before looking at her and seeing the truth settle in her expression, while Karen sat with silent tears running down her cheeks as she realized the depth of what she had overlooked or ignored. Roy made one final attempt to reclaim control by saying, "If you had all this money this whole time, you should have given us more. We are your family." But I looked at him steadily, feeling the calm of years of pain turning into clarity, and replied, "Family does not steal your future and call you trash." And the room fell silent except for the distant sound of waves breaking against the shore. In that moment, the exposure became complete, not just for them, but for anyone watching, including Mrs. Johnson, who stood quietly absorbing the truth, and I felt something inside me shift into place. the beginning of the karma that had been circling for years, returning to its rightful destination, not through anger, but through truth that could no longer be denied. For the first day or two after the confrontation, the house felt strangely quiet, as if the walls themselves were adjusting to the presence of people who had once dismissed me and now had no choice but to exist inside a space built entirely from the success they mocked. And during that time, Roy barely spoke to me except for grunts at breakfast or muttered complaints about the firmness of the guest room mattress. Karen stayed small and apologetic, tidying things that were already clean, moving as if she expected permission for every step. And Tyler mostly kept to himself, absorbing the shock of truths he had only just discovered. But Roy walked around with an air of forced confidence, trying to act unbothered despite the way his posture faltered every time his eyes drifted to the ocean view that contradicted everything he ever claimed about me. On the third afternoon, he knocked on my office door pretending politeness and said he wanted to talk man to man, a phrase that made my jaw tighten because it had always been code for him demanding authority. He had never earned, but I told him to come in because I wanted to hear what angle he would try next. He closed the door behind him and cleared his throat dramatically before launching into a rehearsed speech about second chances and how everyone deserves an opportunity to rebuild. Then he said he had been thinking about starting his own business, something independent that would finally get him out from under the stress of construction work. And before I could respond, he added that he needed me to invest because as family, I had a duty to help him get back on his feet now that I had more than enough. I watched him carefully, taking in the entitlement dripping from every word, the expectation that my success was a resource designed for his convenience. And I asked quietly, "Did you ever believe I could be more than trash?" letting the question hang between us like a mirror he did not want to look into. He blinked, taken off guard, and then looked away, muttering something about how blood is blood and family has to support each other. Whether or not they agree on everything, avoiding the heart of the question, because to answer honestly, he would have had to admit that he never believed in me at all. I opened the folder I had prepared earlier that morning because part of me knew he would eventually pivot to asking for money, and inside it were printouts of the unauthorized credit accounts he had opened in my name, the fraudulent charges the lawyer had examined, and the statement from the credit bureau confirming identity misuse. When I placed the folder on the desk in front of him and asked him to read, he scanned the documents quickly, then looked up with a flicker of panic, the first crack in his bravado appearing like a hairline fracture in glass, and he said, "I think you are misunderstanding this. Things were tight. We needed help. You owe this family after all we did for you." His words sounded smaller than usual, as if even he felt the weight of how hollow they were, in a house he had not paid for, standing on floors I had chosen, surrounded by a future he had tried for years to prevent me from having. And I leaned back in my chair and said, "I spoke to a lawyer. I have enough to file charges," and the silence that followed stretched between us like a cliff edge. He opened his mouth to argue, but nothing came out, and before he could regroup, I added, "I am not sending you to jail, I am just giving you back your life without my money," and hearing that sentence aloud felt like placing a boundary made of steel. He tried to protest, saying, "You cannot just cut us off, we are family," but the irony of his words made my voice steady, rather than shaken, as I replied, "You cut me off first every time you called me trash, every time you stole from me, every time you rewrote my story so you would look like the one who saved me." When he left the room, his shoulders sagged in a way I had never seen before, not defeated exactly, but unmasked. And the truth was that losing access to my resources hit him harder than any argument ever could, because control had always been his currency, and now he had none. That evening, I sat with my mother at the kitchen counter and told her gently that I would help her find a place where she could live peacefully without constant pressure. And the next morning, I signed a lease for a modest apartment in her name, paying the move-in costs up front on one condition written directly into the contract: that no adult male could live there. without my consent, a stipulation that ensured Roy would never again siphon her stability for his own comfort. Karen cried when she saw the keys, not from sadness, but from a kind of stunned relief, and though she did not say the words aloud, I could feel the gratitude in the way she held the small silver key like it was something sacred. Meanwhile, Roy spent the next few days calling people from church, trying to regain sympathy, spinning stories about being mistreated and claiming I was ungrateful. But what he did not realize was that Mrs. Johnson and 2 others had witnessed the truth at my house, and when he told them I had abandoned the family, they exchanged knowing looks and gently corrected him, saying they had seen what really happened, and for the first time his narrative began to crumble publicly, rather than just privately. Tyler approached me later that week asking if there was any way he could start fresh too, not financially, but personally, because he realized how much of his life had been shaped by Roy's influence, and I offered him an internship with a partner company. Reed Vision collaborated with a paid position that would give him the chance to rebuild on his own terms, with one requirement that he sign his own lease and learn to live independently without relying on his father. He agreed wholeheartedly, and the sincerity in his voice gave me hope that maybe one person from that house would learn from the unraveling rather than repeat it. As for Roy, the consequences finally began to sink in the loss of money, the loss of narrative control, the loss of a place to anchor his authority, and for the first time he felt the weight of a world where manipulation carried real cost. Not because I punished him, but because I stepped away and left him to face the mirror he had avoided for decades. 6 months passed quietly after everything settled, and in that time the house by the ocean finally felt like home, rather than a shelter built out of exhaustion, and I began waking up without that tightness in my chest that had followed me since childhood, because for the first time I was living a life that was not shaped in reaction to someone else's cruelty. The acquisition had finalized smoothly, and although my title shifted from founder to CEO within Cloudwave's innovation division, the change brought a kind of stability I had never expected, giving me room to build, to think, and to breathe without constantly calculating the next financial step. And with that stability came the realization that success meant nothing if it did not lift others who were trapped the way I once was. I spent evenings on the deck listening to the water and thinking about all the women I had met over the years who whispered about credit cards opened without their consent, or inheritances taken before they turned 18, or partners who used money as a leash. And slowly the idea for the Reed Resilience Program took shape, not as a charity, but as a framework for escape, a way to give women tools instead of temporary relief. When it launched, I funded it personally, using a portion of my earnings to host workshops in community centers across Southern California, where financial counselors taught the basics of credit repair, and lawyers explained how to document financial abuse, and volunteers walked women through the emotional steps of untangling from toxic family dynamics. And every time I watched someone's posture change from fear to possibility, I felt something inside me knit itself back together. One Tuesday afternoon, I walked into a workshop unannounced just to observe, and there in the second row sat my mother, her hair pulled back, simply her hands clasped tightly around a notebook, listening to a speaker explain how to rebuild after decades of being financially erased. And seeing her there made something sharp inside me soften, because she was trying in her own timid way to restart a life she had almost lost. She approached me timidly afterward and said she had not known how much she needed to hear other women speak until she walked into that room. And even though neither of us talked about Roy or the past that hung behind us like a long shadow, we both understood that she was finally stepping into a world where she was not controlled by him anymore. Tyler visited me more often too, and one evening he stood on the balcony beside me while the sun dipped low and apologized for staying silent that night, saying I should have spoken up. I knew it was wrong, but I froze, and I am sorry. And I told him quietly that apology mattered more now than it would have then, because he saw the truth clearly for the first time. His life was unfolding in a healthier direction, working steadily at the internship I helped arrange, even though he insisted on earning every step himself and watching him grow rather than collapse under the weight of Roy's expectations. Reminded me that breaking a cycle sometimes begins with one person stepping away. I did not see Roy for months, and I did not go looking for him because some endings do not require dramatic closure. But one warm afternoon in early autumn, I ran into him unexpectedly in the parking lot of a supermarket near Laguna, and for a moment I did not recognize him because his shoulders had rounded, his eyes were duller, and there was a heaviness around him that had nothing to do with age and everything to do with consequence. He tried to stand taller when he saw me and forced a half smile that did not reach his eyes. Then he said, "Hey, kid," like he was trying to conjure the authority he once had. And after a pause, he asked if I could spare some change for your old man, acting as though the years of cruelty had been nothing more than misunderstandings. I looked at him calmly, not with anger, but with the clarity that comes from finally stepping out of someone's shadow. And I said, "I already gave you more than you ever gave me, and that is enough." Then I walked away, not because I hated him, but because I no longer needed anything from him, not approval, not explanation, not closure. Quiet justice does not require grand gestures or revenge set on fire. Sometimes it is simply choosing not to carry what was never yours to hold in the first place. And as I stood again on the deck that evening, listening to the ocean, I thought about the word trash. How he had thrown it at me like a weapon, how it had echoed in my head that night like a verdict, but now the word felt small and almost meaningless because I had walked away from the place where it was spoken and built a life that disproved it without ever needing to argue. Trash is not what they called me. Trash is what I walked away from, and saying it aloud to the ocean felt like sealing something shut for good. If you are listening to this and you have lived through toxic family or family betrayal, or been dismissed because you did not fit the mold someone else set for you, I want to ask you something. Gently. What did you do when they tried to define you with their fear, and how did you find your way back to your own worth? Share your story if you can, not for them, but for the people who are still in the middle of it, because sometimes healing begins when someone realizes they are not alone. Maybe your journey includes quiet justice, or silent revenge, or emotional resilience, or choosing dignity over money. Maybe it is about standing up for yourself, or reclaiming respect, or learning a hard lesson in betrayal, or finding truth and closure in your own time. But whatever form it takes, know that revenge through truth is not about hurting them, it is about freeing yourself. And that freedom is worth more than anything they ever tried to take.